Welcome everyone. I will be helping to facilitate this important discussion on inclusion in early childhood. My name is Xander and I use he, him pronouns. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Cubby Cubby people. I have pale skin, have brown hair, and I am wearing a maroon polo shirt. I have a physical disability called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and am proud to be your guide for this webinar, helping to facilitate this important discussion on inclusion in childhood. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that even though we are meeting virtually, I am meeting from the lands of the Cubby Cubby people. We would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work, live, and play. We pay our deepest respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, always was, always will be, that there is no justice without First Nations justice. I would like to encourage everyone watching to pop in the chat what lands they are joining from. In today's webinar, we will be talking about a recap of what we mean by inclusion in early childhood. Then tips on inclusion, including stories from us. This will go for about 40 minutes. After this, we'll have a 5-minute break. We will then come back together and talk about some things to consider for practical tips and finally have some final reflections. CYDA believes hearing directly from young people with disability about their experiences helps families, caregivers, and communities to have high expectations and aspirations for all children. We ask today that we are all respectful of one another and we are inclusive. Sometimes, in talking about our experiences, we might get a question or cover a topic that is sensitive or includes tough stuff to hear. This isn't shutting down the conversation. It's just so that it protects us and you. During this and other webinars, we will use content notes. We will warn you about what we are about to talk about is, for example, ableism or discrimination. People can choose not to hear the sensitive information. Later on, we might not want to answer a particular question posed, and the CYDA team might step in. This isn't cancelling your question or shutting it down. Once again, we just want to make sure everyone's needs are met, yours and ours. Each panelist today will introduce themselves, but today we have with us young people, Emily, Isabel, and myself. From the CYDA team, we have Sue, Miranda, and Liz. Please check your screen name is correct and add your pronouns, i.e. she, her, they, them, he, him, etc. I would now like to ask each panelist to introduce themselves and also share with you the headline of their favorite childhood memory.
Emily, can I get you to go first, please?
Hi, my name is Emily and I'm deaf, and my story my main story will be about video games and SpongeBob SquarePants.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emily. And I'll throw over to Isabel, please.
Hi, my name's Isabel and I have mild cerebral palsy. My main story that I'll be telling is about how I've been included in my life in lots of physical activities despite my physical disability.
Thanks, Isabel. And Xander?
Hi again, everyone. My name is Xander, and I'm a 15-year-old boy who loves my gaming and participating in my school's competitive theatre group.
Thank you. And hi, my name is Sue Tape. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm joining this evening from the lands of the Yugara and the Turrbal people up here in Brisbane. A visual description of myself: I am a white woman of a certain age, over the number 40, close to the number 50, I have black glasses and fairly plain brown hair tucked under a set of headphones, and Lego in the background of my visual. One of my favourite childhood memories is about water. So I remember loving anything to do with the surf, pool, river, and that carries through to my experiences as an adult now. Just, my way of centering myself is with water. And I'd like to pass over to my colleague Miranda, please.
Thanks, Sue. Hi, everyone. My name is Miranda. My pronouns are she, her, and I work for CYDA. I'm going to be joining this webinar today in the capacity where I guess I'll be a bit behind the scenes, just helping out with tech, and also throughout the session using the chat. The facilitators will, talk about some interesting links and resources. I'll be putting them in the chat as we go. But feel free to reach out to me through the chat function if you have any questions that you want me to pass on to the team throughout the session, or any tech questions and whatnot. But yeah, looking forward to the session. And to finish, my introduction, a visual description about me. I am sitting in front of a fairly white wall. I've got brown hair that's just sitting above my shoulders and tucked into a black scarf. And yeah, I might pass to Liz, please.
Thanks, Miranda. Hi, everyone. I'm Liz, and I'm from CYDA, but I'm the Safety and Wellbeing Officer here tonight. So I have posted my phone number in the chat, and if you have any wellbeing concerns, please feel free to text or call. And my introduction, that I am Liz, and I'm from Wurundjeri land. My pronouns are she, her. My visual description is that I have grey hair that I wished was blonde, and in the background of my is a half cut off painting from Vietnam, and I'm wearing a top that is a pastel coloured top with lots of patterns. My first my favourite childhood memory happens to be my first childhood memory of when I was 3. And I lived in a country town on the border of Victoria and New South Wales. It was very hot, and I was at kindergarten with my brother, and I remember eating watermelon, and I loved it.
And
Okay.
we'll pass back to Xander, thanks.
So, just some housekeeping stuff before we begin. The webinar will have Auslan interpreting, which you'll be able to see on the screen alongside the speaker. This session will have live captions, and they will be visible at the bottom of your screen. But if for some reason you cannot see them, click the CC button at the bottom of your screen to access captions. Please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. These sessions will also be recorded to share with others. If you are having any technical issues, please private message our webinar support person, Miranda or Liz, in the chat.
Thanks, Xander. We just wanted to explain this webinar in the context of our whole series. So the whole series of 6 different topics on inclusion in early childhood is what we might describe as a slow burn. So the previous 2 topics, inclusion, when and where do we start, and early intervention and inclusion, are available as recordings on our YouTube channel or on the CYDA website. And this 3rd topic we're looking at examples today with Emily, Isabel, and Xander around easy things to start with and reflecting on young people's experience. The feedback that we get from families and other people who go to sessions around inclusion is that often a full day workshop leaves them, I think, feeling a little woozy or a little dizzy from the volume of information. So the idea is that we are breaking down some of those early childhood topics. So there's still 3 to go after this one. We're going to look at the basics of information, supports, and funding. We're going to tackle in September talking about school ready and what that actually means. Who is getting ready for school? Is it the school getting ready for the child, or is it the child getting ready for school? And then finally, the last webinar that we will run in October will be looking at some of the examples that aren't typically dealt with in the literature or the things that you would find online. So we would encourage you to think of this as a series of topics. You will notice from the recordings that the first 10 or so minutes are fairly standard, because the other thing that we're trying to do is to role model accessibility and adjustments that support young people with disability to engage in online digital learning. So by talking about pronouns and visual descriptions and using captions and Auslan, we're hoping that both families and organisations are able to absorb some of those lessons around adjustments for their own work. You will have received, as part of your confirmation, a link to the slides and the worksheet for today, which it covers obviously the topics that we're going to work through, and we will send out the recording after as well. So we're building on the ideas and the stories of the young people and working towards those meatier discussions in the next 3 as well. And I'll hand back to Xander. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to part 1 and start with recapping what we mean by inclusion. There are 6 things that all children need to thrive, and inclusion is at the core of all 6. Number 1 being health. Every child should live a healthy life physically, emotionally, and mentally. Number 2, learning. Every child deserves access to high-quality learning from the early years on. Number 3, housing. Every child should have the basics of living, including a stable, secure home with a decent family income. Number 4, positive identity. Every child from every culture and background should be confident and respected. Number 5, valued. Every child deserves to be valued, loved, and safe, living free from abuse and neglect. And finally, number 6, participation. Every child should be able to have a say and connect with their family and community. We hope that you see these 6 things as fundamentals, but also as a reminder that children with disability or any developmental delays or difference of any kind have the human right to have all 6 of these like all children. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is clear that all children have rights to enjoy a full and decent life in conditions which ensure dignity, promote self-reliance, and facilitate the child's active participation in the community. And also have the right to effective access to receive education, training and healthcare services, together with rehabilitation services, preparations for employment, and recreation opportunities. This should be received in a manner conducive to the child achieving the fullest possible social integration and individual development. Even as a young child in a play-based setting, there are components to inclusion that are crucial to participating and learning. Physical inclusion. Present and fully participating in the same learning environments that is accessible to all children for the same amount of time. Social inclusion. Socially, all children are welcomed, supported to belong and not separated from their peers on the basis of disability or difference. Curriculum inclusion. Curriculum is delivered accessibly, so all children are included in the same learning material with the appropriate support and adjustments. If you take a look at page 2 of the webinar worksheet, you will see a table that splits out these 3 areas: social, physical, and curriculum, and includes some questions to prompt some ideas. When we shift to the second part of this webinar, you may find this helpful for notes as we share our stories and tips.
Thanks, Xander. On the next slide, and also in your worksheet, you'll see this scale, this heavily weighted scale, and we wanted to just take you through this concept to think about. So it might be you as a family member of a young child with disability, or it might be you in your role of working with families or young children. So this diagram shows a scale balancing families and communities developing their mindset for inclusion and building their skill set for inclusion, and trying to find that balance between those two pieces. So under mindset, and we've written this specifically with families in mind. So the words address the role of families in inclusion. So under mindset, we want people to think about, like we discussed in webinar 1, starting with a vision for childhood, just like everybody else's childhood, and looking beyond diagnosis and beyond prognosis. And using a strength-based approach and having high expectations for every child, and building on what children enjoy at all the different ages, before they get to school, and feeling good about that as a solid base to work from. So families may need to set boundaries around how you let a particular diagnosis or situation overtake all the other aspects of your child and your family. And that's one of the things that we're looking for people to balance. So remembering that the child is more than their disability and needs the parent or the primary caregiver as much as an advocate and the manager of all things that happen in their lives. And this means that families and the primary caregivers often end up wearing multiple hats. So some days you are a parent, some conversations you will feel like you are the taskmaster or the therapist. And knowing which hat to wear and when to swap is one of trial and error. And this is where bringing in and building family support and allies to support families and children really gives families space and time to focus on who they are and how they can create this balance. So the other thing we're asking people to look at in mindset is also cultivating peers and friendships for the child and for the family to build those informal supports and the ones that will help support the vision for the child that the family has. And this may not be the people that you initially think. You can find different allies and different supports in all sorts of places as you progress through the bringing up of a child. So it will feel like a lot. That sounds like a lot. It's not something that you sort of tick off on day one, but it's what we would like people to have as a reference point, as a reminder that it is a juggle and it is a challenge. So in building your skill set for inclusion, one of the most important things here that we talked about in the first webinar was the benefits of introducing and advocating for your child in a way that creates positive and affirming language around them and doesn't solely relate to their disability or learning difficulties, etc. So we talked in webinar 1 about my inability to drive a manual car and the fact that I hate and refuse to eat celery. And I suppose that being the starting point of an introduction doesn't give you any idea about interests and strengths and what makes me successful. So I think the right introduction can really set up a more meaningful and valuable conversation where the family's role as the advocate can lead to a better outcome than if we purely focused on my inability to drive a manual car and eat celery. So going back to me, what it does, what I can tell you about that is I have a great 30-year safe driving record. So that's one of my strengths. And I'm a big fan of spinach as a source of iron, regardless of what celery does not provide me in my life. So focusing on those strengths and thinking about how a child is introduced, or how they are, how they exist in a space because of the adults providing that introduction and providing that segue for them. So when families assist, the other thing, and the second one on here is about families sifting through the numerous resources and pieces of information that are out there, and how we would like them to build skills to access and use technology for gathering, filtering, and digesting that information, because there is so much, there are so many different sources. One of the things that we would always suggest is to prioritize listening to the voices of people with disability as your first point of call, because obviously anything from lived experience is going to give you a unique perspective for that child. So one of the things that families of older children speak about, and obviously our young people during these webinars talk about, is how over time a community is being built around the child and the family, and how that building that community came from practice, jumping into difficult and new places and giving things a try, and finding, you know, new and interesting allies as we go along. The other thing that families talk about is the process of looking at what works and what doesn't work, and also evaluating, regrouping, and capitalizing on hard work and success. So it's really important to also celebrate success, and make sure that people are aware of the role that they play in that success. This could be a simple thank you, or a more detailed meeting and discussion on what went well. One of the lessons that I've absolutely learned as a parent is the need to recognize success, and to help other people to understand the fantastic role that they've played. You know, things don't always go well, so it's really good to have some insight as to why something worked well and how it could hopefully be repeated. So it's really important to also have that mindset around celebrating success. So just to sort of move on from this slide, but for families, that balance between mindset and skill set is critical, and building a community to support them in doing that. Children and families will feel the pressure at times, so that's where being able to have that balance we think is really helpful. So we're going to move on, and delighted to know that I will stop talking, and we're really excited now to share with you the stories of our 3 young people this evening. And for this webinar and all the others in the series, this is the framework around that we build these webinars around, is the sharing of stories from young people related to the particular topic. And so I have asked my 3 wonderful young people this evening to share with us their stories around the categories that Xander introduced you to before. So physical inclusion, we'll talk about that to start with, social and emotional, and then curriculum inclusion. So I'm going to ask Isabel to go first, throw Isabel into the deep end. She did know that. And just if you could kick us off on what story you would like to share, please.
Of course, thanks, Sue. Physical inclusion for me was a big part of my life as a child, because cerebral palsy does affect me in a physical way. I was very fortunate as a kid to be involved in a lot of physical activities such as dance, yoga, and swimming lessons. I grew up in Darwin, so swimming was a really big part of our lives. And when I was first learning, as everyone does, I needed some help. Things I needed some help with that might have been different from other kids was getting in and out of the pool was a struggle for me sometimes. And I couldn't kick my legs as well as other kids. So when we had just like a kickboard and I was kicking, I really didn't move a lot in the pool. So my main memory as a kid was my mum, before I started swimming lessons, even as like a 4 or 5-year-old, she taught me what to say when I got to swimming lessons so I could be successful myself, because she wasn't able to be there with me. And we would practice together. And so I would say, she would teach me to say, my name is Isabel and I have a disability and I might need some help to do some things. But if I need some help, I'll let you know. So then I was able to advocate for myself. And this has been a huge part of my life, even as I've grown up into an adult, as I've taken that into other things in my life as well. Me being able to say that to the instructor or whoever was running the session enabled me to participate in these activities the same way as everyone else did. And if there was anything that I couldn't do, they knew and were able to change it or do something slightly different, so I didn't feel like I was being left out. So from those things, it's also impacted my life a lot, because I ran some disability workshops with some kids with disabilities. So I ran dance workshops and movement workshops, and now I'm a teacher working with kids who have disabilities as well. So these small things in my life that have made a huge difference and made me feel included have kind of changed the how my life has turned out.
Sue speaking. Isabel, can I just ask you a question first before we hand over to Emily? One of the things that I've heard from young people is that it's also a challenge to get other people to recognize progress. So it's great to hear that you could explain that you would, you needed support and you would let them know when you needed help. Was it also necessary, say in the swimming pool example, to remind people that you could do something now and you needed support to do the next skill? Is that
100%? Yeah. Because just because you need support once doesn't mean that you need support every other time. Because I was able to learn skills that I previously needed support doing. So sometimes I would have to say, I don't need help anymore, I can do this on my own. And still, as an adult, I just want to do everything on my own. I want to be independent. And that was another thing that my mum instilled in me as well, that I needed to be independent, even though I needed help for some things. It's about doing as much as I could for myself.
Thank you, Isabel. And Emily, can I throw to you now for your story, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So my first story is about my really earliest memories. So growing up from 2 weeks of age, actually, I would go to the beach in my family, where my family shack is, up in northern Tasmania, every summer until I was about roughly 18 years of age before going to uni. And the reason why I remember these memories is because it's one of the very few times my disability, I guess, in a way disappeared. And even though I needed help going over, because there was little stairs, but then it was like probably rocks, probably 20 meters before you actually hit the actual beach. And so my parents and then eventually my brothers would walk me across the beach, and that was normal. Like, it wasn't like, oh, we poor Emily, she can't walk across the rocks. But being able to do that and continuing to do that all the way up until I can just do it on my own now, but it's taken a really long time. But then getting to the beach and having those, I would suppose you would say, normal beach memories, playing in the sand, going to the beach, and even apparently escaping it to go to the beach because that's all I wanted to do. So they ended up putting a lock on the gate, and apparently that didn't even work. And then now as an adult, I can have those conversations. Oh, you went to the beach as a kid too, or what did you do, or those kind of things, and just having those nostalgic moments and feeling like at peace and at home and feeling like a real person every time I go back to that beach.
Absolutely. It sounds like great memories to me, the water lover says. Thank you, Emily. Xander, can I throw to you, please?
So, for my first story, when I was younger, I was the one tripping over literally everything and not having the strength to do activities like climbing trees. I don't know why some kids did that. And I struggled with pain when trying to write. After my diagnosis, it did take some time to work on solutions to try and build up some strength. I found that to socialize with friends, I had to do things like going swimming, where it was the one place where I could keep up. When I was young, Mum did this a lot, but then I learned as I got older the importance of being upfront and honest with my friends so that they knew how to include me more in activities. Having this type of communication between myself and those around me has built a good network of support people who have developed a greater understanding of disability and how it affects me in my daily life. I think it would be great for more people in society to have this opportunity to gain perspective and a better understanding of a day in the life of a person with a disability. I found that society has many people with very good intentions, but a lot seem rather clueless on what inclusion should look like. Most of us logged in today for the webinar, whether it is as a young person with a disability or as a parent or guardian of a young person with a disability, have a great opportunity to break down walls of ignorance by just being more open about what disability looks like in our lives.
Thanks, Sandra. I think if I can ask whoever would like to chime in for this conversation, one of the discussions that was had this morning was around extended family and the role that they often played in young people's lives, particularly in those early years. So, you know, mucking around with cousins in holiday situations, and that physically having those role models and people who understood who you were was really helpful. Is that some, and we will talk about siblings later as well, but that sort of extended family, would any of you like to just comment on that first before we move on?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. So I was very lucky and privileged to have an auntie that worked in the exact same childcare centre that I went to as a child. So being able to have that direct support was really important for me, but also able to teach the other educators how to support me and also how not to judge some of the things that she did. Like, for example, I'm not this bad anymore, but I used to struggle eating a lot, and the only way I would eat was to have white sauce, or what is known as bechamel sauce, on top of everything. So she would go and make a batch and put it on top, and I'd happily eat, and then my mum would be so confused as to why I actually was recorded that I did eat that day, but she found out later that she actually snuck some bechamel sauce on top. So being able to continue those supports in other areas has also been really important. And as I was growing up as a young child, to have those opportunities with my extended family, just like my brothers did, was really important, even though we possibly did slightly different activities than what they did, but still able to have those really good quality times with my family.
Fantastic. And Isabel, did you have anything that you want to share about extended family and the role that they played?
Yeah, I was actually the first grandchild in my family, and I lived in Darwin and the rest of my extended family live in Adelaide. So whenever we were fortunate enough to travel to Adelaide and I got to visit my cousins, we would play this game where my grandma had like two doors that circled around her through her kitchen and through her lounge room, and we would just run circles and circles and circles and circles. And even as really young kids, my cousins understood about my physical disability and would purposely slow down or do something. And I didn't know this at the time, only now as an adult do I know these stories. They would slow down, or they would not tag me, or they would flip the other way and do another lap so that I still felt included in the game, and wasn't always last.
That's fantastic. Okay, so we might move on now, if that's all right. So the next area that we wanted to cover, if that's okay, is tips for social and emotional inclusion based on the experiences that you've had. And Isabel, I'll throw to you first for this one, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. There are some physical inclusion aspects in my social emotional story as well, because that's the main part for me and my disability. In Darwin, when anyone had a birthday, the main place that everyone would go was Skate World, because it was the only roller skating rink, and it was just the best place to be. Roller skating was really hard for me. I don't have very good balance. Then adding wheels onto that, like I fall over all the time anyway. So then when you add wheels onto that, it was just a whole nother level of tricky and a big barrier to me being included in people's birthday parties and the games that they would play on this roller skating rink. What was really great about skateboard is I would do some skating around and hold on to the rails on the outside, but they used to play games like figure eights, and you had to go into circles and things. They had these little chairs that people could sit in. So instead of skating around, I would sit in a chair, and my brother or my dad would push me around so I could still be part of the game, even though I wasn't necessarily skating.
Fantastic. As someone who had shock horror experiences skating, that sounds great. It was not a natural talent for me either. Emily, can I get you to go next, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the most challenging and stressful times, but also rewarding times of my childhood was birthday parties. You know, being a deaf person and the type of deafness that I have, you know, birthday parties can be quite loud and overwhelming and all this and that. But I remember this particular birthday party, I think I must have been 5 years old, and we will go to the hottest place in town for 5-year-olds, which was the Road and Safety Centre, where it's basically a little centre where it's like a mini town where there's like full on like traffic lights and roads and things. And, you know, being a part of that society, I guess, in those brief hour or however long you were there was great, because, you know, you had to follow the rules, and, you know, some of us would pretend to be police officers and run off and, you know, try and tag down the person who just ran that red light and all this and that, and still having those normal moments. But I think what really stood out for this particular birthday, because all of us, you know, went through that stage, was when we were doing presents, and this particular boy gave me this beautiful fairy drink bottle, and I was really into fairies at the time, and just having that social connection, actually somebody remembering what my interests were at the time, and just having that genuine connection, I think what's really important for those early years, to have those genuine connections. And now as an adult, I think it's really important to still have those connections as an adult, and to still, you know, have friends and stuff as an adult, and encouraging that for those of us with a disability as well, because we want friends too.
Absolutely. Thank you, Emily. Xander, I'll throw over to you, please.
It didn't unmute. Growing up, trying to connect with your siblings is obviously important, but for me, it was kind of difficult. I couldn't always safely go on family hiking trips or go camping. Instead, I had gaming. Gaming was and still is a mutual interest for me and my siblings, and is how we bonded, despite me having a disability. Because of the nature of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, I was often fatigued, but I was also quite competitive. Gaming gave the right balance of fun and competitiveness, but also the breaks that I needed, or if I needed them. Before I go into this, it's like slight content warning of like kind of ableism, but it's unintentional, but it's still ableism. Family gatherings were always kind of intimidating for me. Sure, they were my family, but like everyone else at that time, they didn't 100% get my disability. It took the extended family some time to understand why I was tired almost all the time and why I couldn't cut my own food and why I was asking so much help for just little inconvenient things that most children could probably do by themselves. But as my disability is invisible, it took them time to understand that I was just a typical kid. The content note is good now, by the way. There's no more ableism. And I just needed to do certain things differently. Sometimes this was by using equipment or asking people for help or completely switching the activity together. As I grew up, I found I've been able to advocate for myself more confidently to set things up regarding planning activities that provide the best opportunities for me to be included. I'm also looking at potentially being a disability advocate as a job because I am surprisingly good at being like, no, that's not right. I've very, very self-righteousness. It's kind of annoying.
Having listened to you for some time on these webinars, Xander, I wouldn't call it annoying. I would call it brilliant self-advocacy. So very happy that you're part of this process. We are going to take a 5-minute break now because it's a good spot to do it. And then we'll come back and talk about curriculum inclusion. The other thing I would like to encourage our audience to do is to think about if they have any questions, because we'll have a Q&A session coming up shortly as well. So it is 7:45 Australian Eastern Standard Times. We're going to break for 5 minutes, so we'll be back at 7:50. So please take a 5-minute break. We'll be back. Thank you, everybody. We'll go back to our conversation now about inclusion. So the last area that we wanted to touch on, and great to hear stories from our young people this evening, is around tips for curriculum inclusion. Now, we wanted to focus on what that looks like, acknowledging that the main place that you would have curriculum inclusion is in a place of formal early childhood learning, but wanted to start to get families to think about curriculum inclusion, because obviously it becomes a really important aspect when kids go to school, that they are physically included, social and emotionally included, and included in the curriculum that everybody else is engaging with. So maths, science, English, and the actual stuff that's happening in their grade. So we wanted to introduce this idea as early as possible, and which is why we're talking about curriculum inclusion, and that being really included to learn the same things as others of the same age, be in the same places with the same sorts of people as everybody else, with support and adjustments that might be necessary and appropriate. And I think we've sort of touched on this in a way around the birthday party conversations that we've already had, which were great examples of that as well. But I will throw over to Isabel for her next story as well, please.
Thanks, Sue. My curriculum adjustment story is not so much academic adjustments, but again, physical, as PE was a big part, as is every part of every kid's life in school. Gymnastics was taught at my school for some reason. And we had an instructor who was Japanese, so there was obviously a big language barrier there as well. So some of the self-advocacy skills that I had learnt, even up to that age, it was trickier because he didn't understand English very well, and then he didn't understand disability on top of that. So it was trickier for us to communicate. But he was one of the best people that gave me options that I could do that were still gymnastics activities. like, for example, kids were doing backward rolls. I could not do a backward roll. He gave me a wedge to backward roll onto. Those where you run up and jump on the trampoline and do a front flip or a star jump or whatever it was, he lowered the trampoline for me so I could actually jump up onto it. And those things just never were done to me prior to this point in like a school setting. Like, I was able to do these outside of school and extracurricular activities, but for me to be included in these things at school was like a really big moment for me, because I was still doing it with the rest of the kids in my class, and even though it might look a little bit different, I was still able to join in. And as a teacher now, these things just make, like, I just think about these things when I'm doing my job every day and think to myself, because I have a lot of kids with disabilities in my class, how can I make their lives easier, and how can I make sure that they're still learning what they need to learn, but presenting it in a different way, or completing it in a different way, or showing me that they know in a different way that might look different to somebody else. And we just have this culture in my classroom of everyone learns differently. We might not look the same when we're learning, but we are all learning the same thing, and we're all doing our learning. And even as I teach 7-year-olds, and they're able to understand that just because someone next to them isn't doing exactly what they're doing, that we're a team and we support each other.
Isabel, can I ask a question just about, I suppose, you said that was the first time you'd had those sorts of adjustments in that environment. Do you think, or can you look back and see whether there was an impact on the other kids, seeing those adjustments made for you and the benefits of that for you as well? Do you think they could see that?
I definitely think so, because I wasn't able to join in with PE up until this point very much. I did some, but not to a marked extent. And I guess, and content note on this around ableism, there was a lot of assumptions made about, oh, it's gymnastics, Isabel just can't do it, we'll have to just give her something else to do. And that wasn't the case at all. So I just felt really lucky and just felt at peace that I could do something with and my other friends and whoever else was in my class. And I guess that sounds weird to feel like that, but because it was the first time, it was a really big deal.
That's great, thank you. Emily, can I throw to you, please, for your story?
Yeah, so my story will be a bit similar to Xander, as he was talking about video games. But for me, those kind of curriculum supports and adjustments didn't really come in until grade 1, really, because I wasn't really diagnosed until then. So also know about how diagnosis can play a big part into funding, all that stuff. But I do remember when we got given the Nintendo GameCube, so we're going a bit far back there. And my younger brother got given a SpongeBob game for his birthday. And one of the things that it had on the game, that it automatically had subtitles in their settings. You actually had to go in and turn it off, rather than instead of going in to turning it on. And what we'll do, we'll sit around the TV for hours on end and play and share the controller, and each of us trying to defeat the level, and we're all really struggling to do it, and then trying to figure out why this game designed for 6-year-olds, it's taking, a 13, 14-year-old struggling to defeat the game, but still having those struggles and those triumphs, and me jumping over one of the levels and picking up and playing at the same time, and able to have access to it and able to read the subtitles when obviously the audio at that point of time wasn't that great, was really good. And just those are just the best memories. Now as an adult, we continue to game together, we continue to play together, and it's just an activity that doesn't need modification really for me to participate. So it's just something that I just love to do.
Fantastic, thank you, Emily. Xander, can I throw to you next?
Yep. Once again, when I was younger, we all remember when we were younger and we were going absolutely nuts whenever we saw our friends or whenever it was break. But for me, I was kind of like their level was here and I was kind of like here. So I was kind of at like 50% and they were at like 110. And that's mainly due to the nature of my disability with my chronic fatigue. When choosing activities or when I was going out, we purposely planned breaks and shorter activities. And I found particularly on school excursions, the last thing they thought of was that, even though it's the most simplest thing you can think of. But of course, they have other things to handle. But yeah, school excursions were kind of annoying for me because of that, because I remember one time we were going to Australia Zoo and the classes were split into like 3 different groups. And instead of being in one of 3 groups, I had to go with one of the teacher aides and like one other person and like one of my friends. And like for me, that was good, but it felt like the bare minimum, where it probably would have been a nicer experience if it was like, instead of just 1 or 2 people, like whatever group I'm in, they just take a different path, or like they all take a break if I need to take a break, which obviously, kids being kids, some might complain being like, oh, can we move on now? But you know, that would make it feel more inclusive, I think. But one of the good things is pacing myself, which kind of leads into this. Learning to pace myself was kind of a really big thing for me, that I learned from the support of my family and my OT and physio, and just taking a moment to figure out where my body's at in terms of fatigue and pain and whatever, and just before I go and just absolutely do something and let my inner child just go vroom, actually think about it and be like, do I have the energy for this right now? Should I take this slow? And as much as this kind of ties into curriculum, but at the same time not, yeah, it was interesting learning that skill. Yeah, because it kind of crosses over to some degree. I changed the original idea I had because then I realized that doesn't 100% relate to curriculum. So
It's okay. That's all right.
Yeah.
So we were going to pause now and see if anyone had any questions, because we've got 3 other things that we want to run through just to highlight as important things to consider in inclusion tips. But are there any questions from our audience? If you would like to use the chat or the Q&A function, we've got both running. Thank you, Emma. If we don't have any straight away, we might keep moving. So I'll throw back to Xander and I'll ask Miranda to start sharing the slides again, and we'll have another opportunity towards the end as well. Oh, hold on. No, we have a question. So Jess is asking, Isabel, I work with children with disability and also mum to a child with disability. Really learned a lot from the way your parents empowered you to self-advocate and ask for help when you needed it. I've been thinking about how we might level that down in the early childhood setting or adapt it to children who are non-verbal. Any tips?
At my school, we have a lot of students who are non-verbal, and I obviously don't know if this is accessible to you, but they use the iPad app Proloquo to go, and they have the help, like they have a help icon on their main screen, which they've obviously been explicitly taught how to use and what that means. And that we've seen a huge difference in those kids' asking for help in multiple situations. If you don't have access to Prolo Quotago or a pod, you also have just help cards. So I have a card that just says help on it, or is yellow for I need help. I use like a traffic light system in my classroom. So red, yeah, what like Sue's holding up, except green meaning I'm great with my work, yellow meaning I need some help, or red meaning I have no clue what's going on at all. So they just hold up their help card, and obviously if they're younger, as you're talking about, they would just have the one color or one card that just means help. Obviously, again, explicitly teaching them that this card means if you need help, you can show this to me. And then obviously adults modeling that as well. We've seen that those things really help kids to learn to self-advocate for themselves. And additional to that, even though adults want to help them, and we know that adults want to help them, to stop that thing that we do as adults and parents to just jump in straight away and to not give them a chance to have a go, even if they are nonverbal. So it's just about giving that wait time or that think time as well is really important, because sometimes they would ask for help, but they just potentially weren't given enough time to process.
Thanks, Isabel. Also, Jess, Ellen and I, the young person who was on this morning's webinar, had a big discussion, because Ellen was largely nonverbal when she was little, and she remembers that experience and talked about the development of speech and things like that. So maybe also have a listen to this morning's webinar as well, because there was she gave some great tips about how she really found her voice and was supported by her family around that too. So depending on where your child is at, because obviously Isabel's talking about high tech or low tech AAC, assisted and augmented communication. Xander, sorry, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just gonna touch on the whole nonverbal thing. I have anxiety, and sometimes it just gets way too bad, and I'm just I usually it only lasts for a couple of hours, just the initial brain just like, no, I don't want to deal with this, and in response I just don't say anything. One time that literally happened for about a week and a half, which was kind of concerning for some people, but figuring it out. It's really hard when people, they're like trying to help, but they don't give you the initial wait time to think about it, because they think that if you're not saying anything, then you're probably not thinking about it, or you've just completely not understood what they said. But for me, I physically just cannot say anything. So being able to, like, sometimes I'd use my phone because I can't really write, or I'd do like a thumbs up or something. Because it's only come up recently, I don't have access to it currently, but we're making plans of like having cards for when I do feel like that. I can pull up a card and say that I'm nonverbal, and if people need an explanation for that, have a card that explains it, because yeah, we're slightly convinced because of previous experiences that I might be autistic, but that's not confirmed. So for now, we're just blaming it on good old anxiety. But yeah, it's just a thing I thought I'd mention.
Thank you. We really appreciate it. Emily.
Just to jump on the bandwagon too. I have worked with, yes, it was in a high school situation, but I have worked with students who have nonverbal. And thinking outside the box, I thought, well, I'm deaf, and being the Auslan assistant, I thought, well, why not use Auslan and try and communicate? And it worked really well. One of the main signs I use with that student with our lovely interpreter would help demonstrate these lovely signs is the sign for help. So to help, I give you help. And then if he needed help, he would pull the sign back and saying, I need help. So, and being able to communicate that way was a great way. The other thing I did in that role, especially when working with my deaf students, is I would model self-advocacy and asking for help from the teachers and staff. And following that, it encouraged the student themselves to ask for help and asking those things, even students coming up to me and going, oh, how can I help my student do this? Or how can I do this? As inclusion is actually much harder than just participating. So being able to open up those conversations and encouraging everybody to ask for help, which was really good. And at the end of the day, we'll all be able to have an inclusive classroom and everybody got help.
Fantastic. I think really that sort of communication element, and this leads nicely into where we're going to next. We're just going to have a quick chat about siblings, communication, and developing advocacy skills. So Xander, are you happy to pick up from here? And I'll ask Miranda to start. Yep, she's onto it.
I did not know I was reading this section. It says Isabel was reading it, but I did not know that.
That's okay. Oh, sorry, Xander. I was trying to dump you in it. Isabel.
It's all right. Thank you. So one area of inclusion that we haven't covered so far is the role of siblings. As you can see on the slide, the Siblings Australia website is a fantastic resource that goes into more detail on each of the 3 areas and many other fantastic resources. We wanted to flag some of the things you might consider for your family. The role of siblings is, firstly, their natural role, to strengthen family bonds across the whole family and childhood experience. Be role models for each other, as well as playmates, and gradually you'll see that siblings take up a role across inclusion and safety for their siblings. Some of the challenges for siblings include feelings of isolation where time or effort might favour the sibling with disability. This can lead to difficult emotions and possibly feelings of responsibility too young and too often. So this brings us to the need to support siblings. This includes deliberately and consciously setting aside time and connection for all family members, supporting and listening to the needs and dreams of all family members, and cultivating skills for future and possible challenges. One of the challenges is finding a balance. Siblings are the first playmates, but also need to be supported, independent young children themselves. Many families tell us that this is a regular challenge as they need to step back and check that everyone in the family is getting what they need. This is a speed trip through the area of siblings. Please check out the Sibling Australia website for more. The next area we wanted to cover was communication. Again, this is a speedy run through of the topic, but we wanted to draw your attention to 2 things. Your child's right and tools to support that the child's right to communication includes fundamental rights, to be offered choices, to express feelings, to be communicated with in a dignified manner, to be listened to learn about life, and to be included in social interaction. We have focused on the slide on a few key rights, but the full version of the Bill of Rights can be found at the link posted in the chat. Tools and techniques. Communication development begins at birth. A young child's communication takes many forms. Communication development is linked to relationships. Observe, wait, and listen, and find your family's strengths. And find a professional to build a trusted relationship. Finally, before we move on to any more questions, we want to mention advocacy and the 3 types of advocacy that are worth thinking about during a child's early life. As the Raising Children website, advocating is speaking up for another person's rights, needs, and interests. Being an advocate involves understanding the issue, thinking about children's needs, and presenting solutions. You can help children learn to advocate for themselves by building their confidence and giving them practice. Self-advocacy is supporting your child to find their voice and look for opportunities to practice, which may mean thinking about the time and place and the supports that may be needed. This is distinct from family as advocates for the child. When children should be front and center, you will need to prepare and practice your message and your approach. It will always serve you well to be clear and patient. Finally, there might be times there is a role for professional advocates. This should always support or work on behalf of your child and your family. Their primary focus should be to help to seek out and defend your child's rights and interests. The CYDA website, or Ask Izzy, is how you might locate an advocate in your area. Now we would like to take some questions if there is any more. Please use our Q&A function to raise your questions.
I have one, please. Self-advocacy and developing your self-advocacy skills. I suppose, do you have any insights that you would share from that, I suppose, the earliest part of your life that you can remember, and how you might have been encouraged by somebody in your family to develop your voice, make your choices? So Isabel, I'll go with you first, if that's all right.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. For me, my mum would always prepare me before going anywhere. If she knew that we were going somewhere that she already knew that I might need some help or support in, we would practice before we got in the car. So I had the speech sorted in my head, even from, as I said previously, I remember being 4 and doing this. Obviously, being nonverbal, there's another layer to this, but if your child is able to communicate verbally, there's, even in the earliest childhood, these things are able to be taught, and it's not going to happen the first, second, third, fourth time. But if they're not able to do it at first, even you stepping in as a model to them what to say, even in the moment, if they don't have the confidence, will teach them that if I say these things, someone will know what to do to help me.
Emily, can I ask a similar question, but possibly more specific? Did at any time, and Xander, if this applies to you as well, siblings as advocates or as supports in those sorts of situations and developing self-advocacy, is that something that you experienced?
I think siblings, like my brothers, in a way, didn't really play a part of self-advocacy really until I was an adult. But what was really important is the role that they played in my childhood. May it be tutoring with my maths, it may have been more, as my younger brother grew up and having to have those skills, and watching him learn some of these advocacy skills by me existing, I guess. And just he was placed in the role of the assistant coach of my football team back in my hometown of Launceston, and watching him really know what I needed in those situations, like breaking things down, like saying, stop, you're going to die and will not survive tomorrow and as I say, that challenge of, trying to find that balance of him wanting to push me and wanting me to succeed, but at the same time not having those same outcomes or those same goals of where I should be as a first year player. But watching that relationship grow and foster was really good. And then eventually, when the next coach came in for the following year, me going to him and going, hey, you know more about where I'm at football than I do. Can you come to this meeting that I'm having with the coach, and being able to explain these things, and having like both of us advocate, I guess, which is a special moment that we've had together. And now having the relationships we now as an adult is now ones where we're in a way in equal path, I guess, because we're now adults and not really having to have those fights, I guess, because I just couldn't be who I needed to be. So yeah, siblings are a very important part of my life, and I'm very grateful to have them.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And Xander, to be fair, I suppose, to our audience, without necessarily discussing numbers, you are quite a few years younger than Isabel and Emily. Not sharing the lady's age and not sharing your age. But I suppose, how have you, and you're still in the school system as a student, how have you developed your self-advocacy skills, and have siblings played any role? No need to give them kudos if they haven't, but if they have, could you share with us any insights, please?
I'll get to siblings later, but in terms of self-advocacy, I don't think I properly started to speak up until my high school years, so like year 7 to now. Mainly just because it was kind of like the school had everything they needed to know. We kept telling them to stop making assumptions, but humans are going to do what humans are going to do. Advocating for myself has been evidently a lot more easier in high school, obviously, because you're A, more mature, and B, you have the words for what you're trying to say. And for the most part in primary school, it was not knowing what to say. I didn't know how to describe my disability and what I was feeling like at the time. And all I could say was, I'm tired or I'm sore. And obviously, a normal teacher's going to think that, oh yeah, you're tired, that's all right, just you'll be fine, it's almost home time. But from my perspective, it was like, I had, if someone was like that, I had to stop them and be like, no, I'm genuinely fatigued. Because when I say I'm tired, most people think sleep tired instead of fatigue tired. But that's because most people think fatigue is like the more severe version of tired, which in my opinion, they're kind of, it depends on the context, I guess. But back on topic, in terms of advocating for myself, it's been really good because as I've gotten older and more mature, my sense of justice has just gone like from like 100 to like 200%, where to the point where if something's not right, I will fight it and end up accidentally starting a argument with one of the teachers, which it tends to be the reliefs, which I don't blame them because sometimes they are not given enough information. I don't blame them. But yeah, it's being able to do that and not let assumptions float around and make sure everyone's on the same page. And if a friend is saying something that's completely wrong, being like, kindly, no, you're wrong, but in a nicer way, obviously, than that. But yeah, it's set me up. High school, like most people say, it's kind of like the testing grounds of the real
Everybody's
world,
life.
Yeah, just on a lesser scale.
Yes.
But I think looking at it at that way has really helped because you can't predict how people are going to react. The only thing that you can control is how you advocate for yourself. And if someone doesn't agree with it, or they're like, no, I'm not taking any of it, then they're not worth your time. That's just, yeah. But obviously, advocating for something that you can't change, like I don't know, someone who's like in your group and you can't physically change groups, sometimes they just need a little bit of education, and advocacy kind of helps with that because you end up doing your own like self-research, and then you can give examples and try to help people understand.
Thank you, Xander. Isabel, you've got your hand up.
Sorry, I just really related to something that Xander said about assumptions. And as an adult, I think it's different for me now that I'm an adult, because I can choose the situations in which I advocate for myself or let other people know as much information as I want them to know. And whether I tell them I have a disability or not is up to me. But I can't expect anything from them if I haven't advocated for myself completely, or I haven't said 100%, I have a disability and I need this. So I think it's twofold in terms of expectations and advocacy. As a person with a disability, I can't expect someone else to know what I need if I've not said something. So again, that comes down to confidence and feeling comfortable about communicating those things. And again, that comes down to stigma and how you feel about how someone's going to receive that information. And regarding assumptions, I'm very lucky that my cerebral palsy only affects me in a physical way. When I was at school, there was a lot of assumptions made about me that cerebral palsy affected me in other ways, and that doesn't apply to me. But people would speak to me in a degrading way, in a way that was like I was a baby because they thought I didn't understand. So I think it's about expectations for the person with the disability, as well as expectations for the people who you need support from or who you need to advocate for yourself towards.
Thank you. Now, I'm conscious of time because we will lose our Auslan interpreters in about 5 minutes. So I'd really love to hear from each of you some final reflections and the messages that you want to send people away with. So Emily, can I go to you first, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my final reflection, coming all the way up, living the life where I've lived, I think it's really important. Yes, we've talked about inclusion and all those things, but it's also really important to embrace the disability world. From having a disability in where I don't really fit into either box, disability or normal, it's kind of frustrating coming to a point where I actually fit. So really, like in high school, I was able to meet other girls who are deaf and hearing impaired, and I wish there was an opportunity set aside so we can really foster those relationships and being able to have our normal. And I suppose the other things too onto that is just like our normal is a different normal, and that's okay. For example, like we all know what fire alarms are like. They're loud, they're continuous, they're annoying. But for me, they're just so overwhelming, and I will break down and have a meltdown and I wouldn't learn for the rest of the day. And I will just be told, oh, just get over it. It's fine. It's loud. It's supposed to. But being validated and be like, it is loud. It is hurtful. It is hurting your ears. And having those conversations with the children I work with now from the other teachers explaining it, it's been really amazing just starting to see that switch. And that's something that I think we can teach our children, is to embrace all parts of the world, not just the parts we want to see.
Great, thank you, Emily. Xander, can I pass to you next, please?
Yeah, I think overall, inclusion can be tough at times, but putting inclusion aside, you know, kind of like what Emily was saying, you need to take the time to just embrace the fact that you have a disability. It doesn't have to always be about let's change literally everything. Sometimes just take a moment for yourself, or if you have people in your friend group who have similar experiences to you, to just embrace the fact that you have it as just a part of who you are, and it's in a way an extension of your personality sometimes. Inclusion is important in itself, but sometimes taking a step back from it can help a little bit, because inclusion can be quite stressful because you're having to figure out how to try and do the same thing but differently. That doesn't make any sense, but yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
It's bloody hard work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's for some people it might be simple as instead of using the normal end of a fork, you use your whole palm with like a mushroom handle. Like that's something that I use, for example, because gripping with my fingers can be a literal pain. It can be something as little as that, or it can be trying to redesign a whole curriculum. Either way, it can be quite stressful. So taking a step back from it can actually be really beneficial for people's well-being, and just taking a moment to just, but again, that's not saying that inclusion is not important. They're both equally important. Yeah.
Thanks, Amber. Yes. And Isabel, I'll give you the final word from the young people.
Thank you. For me, as you would have heard through all of my stories, self-advocacy has been a big part of my life. And now as a teacher, I think my biggest thing that helps me as an educator help kids who have disabilities is, number one, education, not in the traditional sense, but as a parent, if parents let me know something about their child or something that helps their child, whether it's in a home setting, I can find a way to transfer that to a classroom setting so that they can feel included in the classroom setting as well. And if we start these conversations becoming normalized conversations with teachers and educators, I think it will make it easier for you as a parent to feel like your child's being included in the classroom, because I know that's really tricky when you can't see what's happening in the classroom or you don't know what's happening in the classroom. So just the education and the communication about you know your child the best, and we're just helping you to include them in a meaningful way. So as much information as you can tell us about how we can support your child, please let them know. It's not a bad thing to information dump in anyway. So thank you.
Thank you. And I think Layla's given us the wish that Isabel was her son's teacher. So I think that's the resounding endorsement there. Absolutely. With just a couple of minutes now, Miranda has posted in the chat some resources and supports to access. Please, we would encourage you. Some of the content may have been quite challenging for people, so we would ask you please to reach out. Liz Hudson also has put her information in the chat if there is anything that has been super challenging and you wanted to have a discussion. First and foremost, I would like to thank Xander, Isabel and Emily tonight for their fantastic contribution to this discussion. These points are nothing other than bullet points on a slide without the stories that accompany them and the insights and the experience from young people with disability. So thank you to those three. Thank you to our Auslan interpreters. Thank you for the behind the scenes to Miranda and Liz. But this again has been an absolutely wonderful discussion, and we hope that you would join us for future webinars. So finally, thank you and good night.